Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me in this section. So today we'll be discussing about safety officers and safety committee members. And if we have the time, we'll also talk a bit about risk assessment. So at every level, be it OOW, chief mate, or master's level, the tendency of you being asked about safety officers, risk assessment is there. So sometimes the examiner can hand over a blank risk assessment sheet and ask you to conduct a risk assessment, particularly if you are in places like South Shields in those days or Southampton. And if you can't be able to conduct a risk assessment, it might mean a failure. So in my case, even during my master's exams, I was still asked a question regarding safety officers and safety committee member. So it's very, very important for you to know because it is statutory, and also the Code of Safe Working Practice for Merchant Seamen also have a detailed section about risk assessment, which is covered in Chapter 1 under Managing Occupational Health and Safety. And then if you also go to Chapter 13, which talk about safety officials. But very important, you need to know which of the version of COC. You know, the latest one used to be 2015, but it was amended in October 2020. So it's free. You don't need to say you want to buy the hard copy, but you can also get the electronic copy everywhere. So generally, the aim of this lecture this evening is to provide students here with the basic understanding and the knowledge of ship safety officer, their roles and the roles of safety committee members. So all of us have been on ships here, whether as cadet or as officers, masters, chief mates. And you know that in every ship that you have been on, except you're on a fishing boat, you must have what we call a safety officer and also a safety committee member. So I'm going to talk about them separately. So I will start to talk about the duties of ship safety officer. Thereafter, I will explain the qualification and the duties of safety committee members. I give you an example. In my situation, when I was doing my master's orals, I was asked by the examiner that if I'm the ship medical officer and I've been appointed as a safety officer, will I be able to take the appointment? Is it right? And I told the examiner, absolutely no, because one of the duties of ship safety officer is to investigate incidents and also to make recommendation. So if I'm the medical officer, that will definitely affect my role of investigation because I'll be busy administering first aid or whatever it is. So it is normally recommended that, you know, a medical officer should not serve as safety officer. So as we go, we'll discuss a lot of them. So before appointing a safety officer, it's very, very important for you to understand the duties of the company because the companies employ you to work on their ship. They just don't employ you to work without regulation. So they have their own duties. So as a company, before you go on the ship, before a company is issued with DOS, it must comply with certain standards, certain regulation before that. So there's also a statutory standard for companies to comply with minimum safety regulations. And this one, you can also find it in COSWOP chapter 13, and then this MS legislation on safety officer, you will find it there. So what are the duties of the company? First one is the appointment of safety officer. Very, very important. So the duties is to appoint safety officer. And sometimes you might wonder, the company, will they come to the ship or will they say, okay, appoint a safety officer? No, you should know that the master of the ship is the representative of the company. And what he does is he's the image maker, he represents the company. So the master of the ship appoints a safety officer. And there are different criteria for appointing a safety officer. Yes, you can find a third officer being a safety officer, sometimes a second officer, sometimes a third engineer, sometimes a fourth engineer. So it's very, very important for you to know that. So this particular regulation, you should be able to know that before you are being appointed as safety officer, you must have a minimum of 2 years sea time. Very, very important. And when that 2 years sea time takes effect from when you attain the age of 18. That's one of the criteria. Like I said earlier, you have safety officer on every ship other than fishing vessels, because fishing vessels are not part of SOLAS vessel. They don't have to comply with Code of Safe Working Practice, SOLAS, and all those things. So for you to have a safety officer on the ship must be able to carry more than 5 employees on board. Any ship that have less than 5 employees on board, then you are not required to have a safety officer. Example, now, if you are crossing from maybe CMS to Apapa Keys, you have maybe some of these MPA small pleasure craft that will enable you to cross. They have 2 crews, so they are not required to have a safety officer. So any ship that have more than 5 crew on board must employ a safety officer. Is very, very important. And what does the regulation say? The regulation says the master, that is a company, shall appoint a competent person as a safety officer. So we are going to look at who is a competent person, because you can't just appoint anyone as a safety officer. You must appoint a competent person as a safety officer. So we look at what is a competent person. You see, before maybe you are being appointed to do a job, to do a fourth engineer job or a third officer job, you must be competent. You must be able to prove that you can do the job. Very important. That is why you have what we call certificate of competency, COC, meaning that you are competent in knowledge, experience. That is why you have the C time. Knowledge, that is why you go to college to have to pass your SQA and to do orals. So it's very important. It's similarly to a competent person when it comes to safety officer. So a competent person is somebody that has sufficient experience, he has sufficient training, he has sufficient qualities to be able to carry out his job satisfactorily, the duties of a safety officer. In some companies today, it is not documented. It is not statutory. Some companies today that you can't be a safety officer without having a ship safety officer certificate. Some companies, though, that they make it a mandatory requirement, but it's not a legal requirement. But in case of oral exam, you can include that, because there's nothing wrong with you giving more information than you giving less information. So that is very important. As per the competent person, you must be able to have the sufficient knowledge, sufficient understanding. You must be able to carry out your duties. You should be able to know, like, part of the duty of a safety officer is to investigate accidents. So as a safety officer, you must be competent in accident investigation, root cause analysis. You must be competent on that. You must be competent on conducting risk assessment, because part of your job is to make recommendation on safety improvement to the master. So it's very important. Like I said earlier on, in addition to being a competent person, you must have a minimum of 2 years consecutive sea time since the attaining the age of 18. From age 18, 2 years of having 2 years of consecutive sea time. And then from the age 18, you are no longer a young person. So I think maybe next week, we'll probably talk about the requirement for young persons on board, what young persons cannot do, because a question that come up quite often during oral examination. So if you are working on a tanker, the requirement is slightly different. In addition to the 2 years, you must have served a minimum of 6 months in such type of tanker, be it a gas carrier, a crude oil tanker or a chemical tanker. So in addition to that 18 years, you must have had a minimum of 6 months service in such ships. So we have seen, look at who is a competent person, who is a safety officer, what are the criteria of appointing a safety officer, Those are questions that the examiners ask you most of the time. So if you go to oral examiners, they can ask you, okay, what are the criteria for appointing a safety officer, and who is a competent person, what is the company role and regulation. But before I go further, if you appoint a safety officer, the master must record this appointment in official logbook. Very, very, very important. So it's one of the key points, or one of the points that you can give the examiner. Okay, the company shall appoint a competent person, and this is a competent person, this is the requirement. And in addition to that, it must be documented in ship's official logbook. So it's very, very important for you to know that. Now, let's keep going. The duties of a safety officer. As a safety officer on the ship, you are not just expected, just to be there. Because you are a competent person, you have enough knowledge and experience, there are certain rules that you must be able to carry out, certain tasks. When you talk of safety, meaning that you are in charge of safety, you have a responsibility of looking after the safety of the ship, safety of the personnel, safety of equipment is very, very, very important. So the duties of the safety officer include improving safety standard among crew. So for instance, now when you are working and you see a crew member not wearing glasses, it's your duty as a safety officer to draw his attention, say, hey, you are supposed to be wearing safety goggles while chipping on deck. You are supposed to be wearing helmet while walking on deck. You are supposed to be wearing safety boots while on deck. So it's very, very important. What you need to do as a safety officer is to improve the consciousness of safety among crew members, to ensure that part of your requirement is to ensure that the code of safe working practice and every other safety regulation regarding to the ship is complied and strictly adhered to. So that's one of the major duties. Then as a safety officer, it means now that you must have a good and a thorough knowledge, a robust knowledge of code of safe working practice for merchant seamen. You must have a knowledge of your company's safety requirement. You must have the good knowledge of ship safety management system, SMS. You must be grounded in ISM code, because your primary responsibility is to reinforce that safety consciousness, among the crew member. Very, very important. The second role of the safety officer, very, very important, is to investigate accidents on board. Very, very important. Accident investigation, accident reporting. If you're on any ship, when an incident happens, the first person they will call him to investigate is not the master. Is not the master, is going to be the safety officer. And that takes me back to one of the person that you cannot appoint as a safety officer is the master of the ship. Although it's not prohibited for you to appoint the master of the ship, but it is recommended that the master of the ship should not be appointed as the ship safety officer. The reason because one of the responsibilities of the safety officer is to make recommendation to the master. So if you are the safety officer, who will you make recommendation to? So one. The second one, I talk about a medical officer. Because you are going to be involved in this particular point of accident investigation and reporting, then you cannot serve as a medical officer. It's very important. So when you are investigating accident, you should be able to have maybe a bit of executive summary of what happened, what led to the incident, when did it happen, where did it happen, why did it happen. So you have different ways of investigating an incident. You can either investigate an incident using the tripod system or the 5 whys. It all depends, and now you have advanced way of investigating incidents, where you can go through the fault tree decision analysis, the hazard, and different things, to investigate incidents. So as a safety officer, you must be well grounded on it. And then after investigating the accident, you talk about what happened, what led to the incident, Then the very, very important aspect is to make recommendation to the master. When you read accident reporting, part of it you will see recommendation for future improvement, recommendation to prevent reoccurrences. So part of your duty is to make recommendation to a master. For instance, if an accident happened and you find out that the root cause of the incident was people were not always wearing hand gloves. So one of your recommendations is to say, okay, before carrying out any task, you must wear your hand gloves. So you are making a recommendation to the master. Very, very important. By making a recommendation, you ensure that that incident will not happen again. But when you don't make a recommendation, you overlook some of the issues, that cause this incident. What they are going to do is that people will not learn from this incident and it keeps reoccurring. It's going to occur. It's going to keep reoccurring. So it's very, very important for you to understand that part of your job is to make recommendation of your findings to the master. Very, very important. I know you are aware of this. Is one of the key roles of a safety officer. At least every quarter, the safety officer carry out the safety inspection of some accessible spaces. You are aware the stores, you make inspection of stores, different areas, part of accommodation, safety aspect. So all these inspections, you are going to record it in the safety officer's record book, which you have, and it's going to be entered in ship's official logbook. You are also going to inspect potable water. That is part of the inspection you make. So it's very, very important for you to conduct this inspection every quarter. It's not only a requirement for Code of Safe Working Practice for merchant seamen, for safety officer, but it's also a SIRE item that the SIRE inspector check. Does a safety officer carry out inspection of accessible spaces at least once every 3 months? Does a safety officer, if you go to also ISM code, you will find out that in ISM audit, these things always comes out. MFC audit, these things always come out. So that's to show you how important a safety officer is. So one of the major roles and responsibility of a safety officer is to make representation, make recommendation to the masters about any deficiency in respect of non-compliance with regulation. If there's a latest M notices in the case of UK ships, you make recommendation to the master, or any provision of the code that has not been adhered to. Is very, very important for you to make recommendation. For instance, if there are some certain aspect of safety that have been overlooked, that have been violated, so part of your rules is to make recommendation to the master on how those things will be improved. So generally, you are more of a safety champion on the ship. So it's very, very important for you to know that. So also, you suggest whatever any other things that you feel, that can improve the safety of the vessel. You make that suggestion, you make that recommendation to the master. So, that you, as a safety officer, you'll be provided with safety officer record book. You will also be, in some companies, they have what we call an accident investigation book. So you keep record of all these incidents, you keep record of accessible spaces. When you sign, the master will sign. You keep record of any injury, any dangerous thing, and you make a recommendation. And then one of the major rules again of safety officer is if you pass and see something not doing the right thing, you have the duty to stop that work. Even if you are second mate and you see a chief mate, let's say he's chipping without goggles, without wearing gloves, you have the role to stop him because your job. Safety officer is a very, 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 very powerful member of shipboard management team. If you look at in certain companies, for every SMT meeting, the safety officer participates. So that's to show you how critical is the role of safety officer. It's very, very important. So that is all about safety officer. We are going to talk about safety committee members, or what we call safety representatives. And every month, every ship is required to carry out a safety committee meeting where safety issues of different departments and safety concern will be tabulated, and then recommendations will be made. So, and members of the safety committee member, there are certain criteria for appointing who will be in that safety committee. But before then, which ships should have a safety representative, or we say a safety committee. So every ship, every seagoing ship that have more than 5 seafarers on board must have a safety representatives, and also constitute what we call safety committee members. So the criteria for those safety committee members is similar to the criteria for appointing a safety officer. You must have more than 2 years consecutive sea time since they attaining the age of 18, and in the case of oil tanker, you must have a minimum of 6 months on those particular ship. And the court recommended as far as possible, each member, each department should have one of their members to represent in a safety committee. Like you have deck representative, you have engine room representative, you now have also galley or catering representative. In the case of gas carriers, you also have the cargo representative, and whole and below, the safety officer is also a member, and also the master is a member. So I've talked about most of these requirements, So now we talk about the safety officer. So what happened? What do they do? It's very, very important. As a safety member of safety representative, you are also responsible for the safety of people in your department. When you see something that is going wrong, or when there's a safety concern, you bring it to the table and tabulate it. You bring it during the safety meeting. Oh, this. We noticed that all the knives in the galley are causing injuries. Oh, we would like this type of knife to be provided. Or the deck representative will say that for every time you are using pneumatic tools, there's excessive vibration. So we need all those gloves that will be able to handle all those sort of vibration, So it's very, very important for you, for safety representative, to have a thorough knowledge of what is going on in their environment. And if there's any potential or hazardous occurrence at their workplace, the department members can consult their rep, and their rep will make recommendation to the master. So it's very, very important for you to know that. So I've talked about all this safety committee. I don't want to go deep into it. So for this safety committee, mostly they meet once in a month. It all depends on the ship. Some can meet even twice in the month. And very important, the appointment of safety committee members must also be documented in deck official, in ship's official logbook. It's very, very important, and is to be signed by master and with one of the ship officer. It's very, very important for you to know that. So, and all the members of safety, all the safety committee members their names should also be written in safety ship's official logbook. And then in addition to that, each safety committee member should be provided with a copy of code of safe working practice for merchant seamen. It's very, very important. It's a criteria, it's a requirement for you to have it. So in oral examination, you might be asked, okay, what are the criteria? What are the requirements, for safety committee members? Okay, you say every ship that have 5 or more seafarers on board should have safety representatives. And then each of the safety representatives should have at least 2 years consecutive sea time since attaining the age of 18. And in the case of tanker, they should have a minimum of 6 months sea time on such ships. And then all the departments should be represented, because what happens is they will take different complaints, different recommendations, and present it to the committee member, which the master chaired. And then the master will make recommendation to the company, his company reps. So it's very, very important for you to know the duties, roles, and responsibilities of safety officials. So thank you very much. We have come to the end of this section. So I think we still have time, so I will still go through risk assessment. But before I go through risk assessment, I'm just going to rush through risk assessment. Do you have any question or any clarification, any doubt, anything that you want me to explain, or you have anything to question to ask? Please feel free.
Screen sharing. Hello, sir.
Hello, yeah.
Okay, sir. I'm sorry. From the beginning of your of the class, you may mention that in your former company or something like that, you have been asked. Sorry, in your oral that you've been asked if you can be a safety officer and at the same time a medical officer at the same time, and you said
Yes.
no. Okay, so
Yes.
I want to ask: is it a recommendation for you not to be a safety officer at
Hello.
the same time a medical officer, or is mandatory by regulation or anything?
Okay. What
Sorry,
happened there?
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you clearly.
Is it a recommendation for you not to be 2-in-1, or is mandatory by
Okay,
regulation or law for you not to be a safety officer and same time medical officer?
Okay, according to the regulation, it says that a company shall, as far as practicable or as possible, avoid appointing a safety officer as medical officer, or avoid appointing somebody who is delegated with the duty of administering medical services on the ship, i.e. in some companies, the chief officer as medical officer. And they gave the reason. The simple reason is because the duty of the safety officer is to investigate accident. And then if you are investigating an incident that happened and you are the same person administering first aid, meaning that your attention is divided. You can't be doing two things at the same time. You'll be the investigator, you also be the one administering. So what they say, they just said avoid. And that is a statement that I would recommend you use. The regulation says that the company should avoid. It does not prohibit. Unlike in the first one, it says the appointment of master as a safety officer is not prohibited, but it's not advisable. It's not advisable but not prohibited. The reason because one of the duties of safety officer is to make recommendation to the master. So if you are the safety officer and you are the master, who are you going to make recommendation to? So I hope this clarifies your question. And that's the way I answered the examiner. I told him that, as a chief medical officer, I'm not, the company is supposed to avoid appointing me as safety officer because this is my role and responsibility to investigate incident, and at the same time I should not be responsible for administering first aid, because meaning that I will not be able to carry out my tasks effectively, and he was happy with it.
All right, thank you very much, sir. And it brings me to the second question of though it's very simple and
Hello?
straightforward. He said the question is is it the shipmaster or the company that must appoint the safety officer on board?
Okay, the regulation says that the company should appoint. And in this case, they define the company. Who is the representative of the company? The master is the representative of the company. And everywhere you go, the master represents the company. He is the company more. So he appoints the safety officer, not someone in the office or whatever it is that appoints. So it's the master who is the company rep that appoints the safety officer.
All right, thank you very much, sir.
Okay, you're welcome. Any other question? Okay, let me go ahead and share the second slide. I'm going to rush this because we are running short of time. So risk assessment. The reason why I started with roles and responsibility of safety officer, safety committee members, it all comes back to risk assessment, because as a safety officer, you must be grounded in risk assessment. Risk assessment is very important. It's not applicable to shipping alone. It's applicable to, our everyday life. For instance, now before you start your car in the morning, what you tend to do is you open your bonnet, and you check, whether you have water, whether your engine oil is short. It's part of assessing, maybe checking your tools. And the reason is to assess, to reduce risks. You are eliminating risks of overheating. You are eliminating risks of engine failure. It's very, very important for you to understand risks. And then before you talk about risk assessment, you should be able to understand, one, the difference between risks and hazards, and two, you should be able to understand the principles of risk assessment, because that often come into play during examination or in our daily lives. Okay, now, so risk assessment. What is risk assessment? It might ask. Risk assessment, in a layman term, you will say, okay, it's a process of identifying hazard and risk factor. Basically, maybe they have the potential to cause harm. Once you identify those hazards, you are going to evaluate the hazard. Once you evaluate the hazard, you are going to, provide, a risk matrix to it to reduce it as low as reasonable as practicable. So that is basically the definition of risk assessment to a layman terms. So what is the aim of this section is for you to be able to understand risk assessment and also working knowledge of risk. So it's very, very important for you to do that. So I'll just quickly go through the just objectives. So first, why do you perform risk assessment, if I may ask? So like I said, you can't just go and start maybe going into an enclosed space without performing risk assessment. That is dangerous. If you don't assess the risks, that there will be oxygen depletion, there might be presence of different sort of gases, the exit, the entering point, you might have issues with ladder. You just go in without assessing those risks. You are subjecting yourself to danger. Danger in the sense that you can die as a result of deficiency in oxygen. You can die. You are going inside the ladder and not in good condition because you did not conduct a risk assessment. And why do you perform a risk assessment? Is to reduce the risks to as low as reasonable as practicable. I'm going to show you a picture now. The picture was taken from Nautical Institute, where some containers were loaded. Somebody, the risk assessment was not properly conducted, and it resulted in fatality. So you can see this kind of incident. What happened here? This happened in Durban. So it's very, very important for you to conduct risk assessment. If risk assessment is being carried out, these things will not happen. So it's very, very important. Risk assessment is detailed in Code of Safe Working Practice for merchant seamen. And also, if you go to Merchant Shipping and Fishing Vessel Regulation and Safety Act of 1997, you also have a detailed information about risk assessment. If you go to MGN, MSN, you also have details about risk assessment. So, risk assessment is very, very important. In every task we carry out in our daily life today, you should be able to conduct a risk assessment. In the case of oral examination, if they ask you, okay, how do you prepare for enclosed space entry? The first thing you say is you conduct a thorough risk assessment before you even start ventilating the space. It's during the process of conducting risk assessment that you realize that, okay, there's a risk associated with oxygen deficiency. And what do? You need to ventilate the place. You need to test the place to reduce that risk. There's risk associated with lack of lighting. what you need to do, you need to illuminate the place, and is quite very important. So when you have group of workers or particular workers at a particular risk, it's very, very important for you to conduct risk assessment. For instance, if you're in dry dock now and you have people that are coming from shore to work on your vessel, you have the responsibility of conducting a risk assessment, because according to the Merchant Shipping and Fishing Vessel Health and Safety Act of 1997, it requires you to ensure the safety of everyone working on board a ship. So if anyone is working on board a ship, be it a shore contractor, it's your duty to perform, to conduct a thorough risk assessment to reduce the risk as low as reasonable as practicable. So you have to also ensure that measures are being taken to comply with employees' duties. You know, if you have the duty to do this, you must conduct risks to ensure that, you know, those duties are being protected. It's very, very important. So in risk assessment, there are different regulations, you know, that concerns risk assessment. So what are the regulations? You need to look at it. You need to look at the Code of Safe Working Practice for Merchant Seamen. Like I said, if you go to chapter 1 of it that talk about managing occupational safety, there's a detailed section that talks about risk assessment there. It gives you the 5 principles of risk assessment. It defines what is risk, you know, what is hazard, how do you conduct. You also have a blank sheet of conducting risk assessment. Like I said, it's chapter 1 that talks about that. So, like we discussed earlier on regarding the duties of a company when it comes to appointment of a safety officer. Now, a company also have a duty of ensuring the health, safety, and well-being of its workers, i.e., they have the duties to provide them with appropriate PPE. They have the duties to ensure that risk assessment are in place. They have the duty to ensure that permits at work are in place. They have the duty to provide guidance for all the operations on board the ships. So it's very, very important for you to know that is their duties. Every company should be able to do this, and that for the family. So part of the duties of the company is to be able to ensure that there's a suitable and sufficient risk assessment to cover all the tasks on board. It's very, very important, from normal duties to more complicated duties, normal routine tasks like normal mopping, cleaning, you know, suji, you know, to complicated tasks on board ship like enclosed space, entering, hot water permit. The company must ensure that risk assessment is in place to cover all those aspects of operations. So another thing, duty of the company is to ensure periodic review of risk assessment. You might be on board a ship and the company will say, okay, we need to review this risk assessment, things like that. So safety committee members, management members, or during safety meeting, you review risk assessment, look at where you need to make amendments, look at where there are shortcomings, you look at the gaps and look at how you can be able to address the gaps, look at areas that are no longer valid and where changes have been made. You should be able to implement those changes. You know, it's very, very important. And on completion of conducting that risk assessment, you know, all the workers, all the crew members must be informed, because you know one thing about crew member, there is this complacency. Okay, I'm used to doing this. This is a normal risk assessment. This is a normal this. But when changes happen, you need to inform them, because they have that mentality. Oh, it's the same thing we are doing. It's the same thing that we are doing. So when there are changes, you amend it. You inform them about the changes. Sometimes most of those changes goes through MOC procedures. So it's very, very important for you to do that. So those are the duties of the company. Now, as a crew member, what is your duty? Your duty is to ensure you look after yourself, look after others, look after your environment, look after your ship. Ensure that people comply with safety regulations. When somebody is doing something, you stop him, step back. You know, it's very, very important. Stop work authority has become the language in every shipping company today. So that is one of your duty. If you see people wearing overall, you see we put safety first, stop work authority, and then different companies have different tools that enable their crew member to do. Some people have like the chronic unease where you can be able to identify weak signals before the actual event happen. So it all depends on which company and what tools has been employed in your company. So before you can be able to conduct a risk assessment, you should be able to understand what is risk. Basically, according to Code of Safe Working Practice for Merchant Seamen, risk assessment have two major components. One of it is the likelihood that the hazard may occur, and also the consequence of the hazardous occurrence or hazardous event. So when there's risk, what happens is the likelihood the risk might occur, the likelihood that if you climb the ladder, you might fall, and what is the consequence of the consequence of that event is very important for you to know. So if you also want to understand risks, you must be able to understand hazard, because we talk about the likelihood of hazard occurring. So what is a hazard? So a hazard can be defined as a potential situation that can cause harm, damage, it can cause injury, it can cause equipment failure, it can cause equipment damage, it can cause loss of asset. For instance, a hazard now, when you see maybe a fire hydrant that is just kept in a walkway, what happened then is the fire hazard is kept on walkway. It's a hazard. What happened? Because someone can easily come and trip there and fall. A manhole has been opened without closing, without any sign. It's a hazard. Somebody can easily go there and trip and fall. So it's very, very important for you to understand the difference between risk and hazard. Risks have two elements: the likelihood of hazard occurring and the consequence of hazardous occurrence or event. So if you understand those two components, then you can be able to proceed further to the stage of conducting a risk assessment. It's very important for you to understand this because it's a question that has been asked several times. People have failed their oral because they can't be able to conduct a risk assessment. So there are different stages of conducting a risk assessment. The first stage is for you to classify the work activities. What kind of work activities are you doing? i.e. enclosed space entering, hot work permits, working at height, rigging of combination ladder, changing of light post, and the rest. So if you have a new job that has not been captured in your company risk assessment, before you conducting that job, you need to classify the work activities. And the second one, what you need to do is to identify the hazard. For instance, the hazard is something that can cause harm, damage to equipment, harm to people, can cause injury. So for instance now, if you are going to conduct mooring operations, what are the hazards during mooring operations? What can happen? There are slip of deck surface, sharp edges that can cause injury, trips and fall. When you talk about communication failure, it's also a hazard because it can cause harm, it can cause damage. Inexperience is very important, lack of appropriate training. Those are the hazards. So after you identify the hazard, what are the risks? Very, very important for you to understand the risk. The risk we talk, it has two elements: the likelihood of it occurring and the consequence. So, okay, now if communication fails, what's the likelihood? Very likely it was going to happen. What is the consequence of this communication failure? It's going to lead to injury, it's going to lead to fatality, it's going to lead to asset damage or loss of assets. It's very, very important for you to understand environmental impact as well. So after that, what you need to do is to estimate the risks. And when estimating the risk, they are going to give you the matrix. We are going to go through the risk matrix shortly, because I know we are short of time. We have about 5-6 minutes. So after you look at the risk matrix, then you have to determine based on the risk matrix, whether the risk is tolerable or not. If it is tolerable, fine. If it is not tolerable, what you need to do is to prepare an action plan. For instance, we talk about communication failure. What do you need to do? What is the action plan? Is to provide a backup means of communication. Is to prepare another independent communication system. If it is lack of training, you should be able to conduct training. You should be able to conduct pre-morning training, every month or before every morning, you should be able to coach people, So what you need to do, risk assessment, like we mentioned earlier, is a continuous process. You need to review risk assessments at regular interval, review the action plan to confirm whether the risks are now tolerable or not. It's not just about saying, okay, have independent radio system, have this, have that. What if the independent radio system, you are in the tanker, as is not something that is intrinsically safe, meaning that you have to review that action plan to ensure that it is intrinsically safe. So the last part of it is for you to be able to ensure that the risk assessment and control measure are effective. There's no way for you to prepare an action plan without it being effective. It must be effective. You must provide it. You can't just say, oh, provide training and you don't. During lifting operation, ensure that the crane operators are adequately trained. Then you now put an OS. No, you must provide controls and they must be up to date. It's very, 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 very important. So this is a sample of detailed risk assessment. This is something similar that the examiner will just hand over to you like this during your orals and ask you, okay, your name of ship is maybe MV Southampton, so you are going to carry out an enclosed space engine or a heavy lift. Please, can you be able to conduct risk assessment? So I give you 15 minutes. He'll go out and ask you to do. So it's very, very important. We talk about hazard. You look at the hazard, talk about the number of hazards that are there. You look at the control measures to protect. We have talked about it to prevent people. Then you come to the assessment, risk assessment factor, or what we call this assessment matrix. You look at the likelihood of it occurring and the unlikelihood. So if you look at the green area, it means you are okay. If you look at the yellow, you still need to do more. If you look at the red, no, the job must not be carried out at all. So it's very, very important for you to cross the reference and check. So most of the risk factor is medium, or that is from yellow or red above. So you mean that additional control measures must be put into place. But when you conduct it and you now look, oh, communication failure, you have the back one, everything. You said, the likelihood of occurrence, you look at it is unlikely, but you have to look at it two ways. Likelihood on occurrence is unlikely, and you look at the severity, because that's what we talk about risks. That's why we started by defining risks. The severity, is it, slightly harm, moderate harm. So if you have the, if you have the likelihood of occurrence, let's say it is very unlikely, and then, the severity is extremely risk, meaning that additional measures must be implemented and you must record it in this section 3. But if you have the likelihood of occurrence is very unlikely, and then, the severity is slight harm or moderate, then no additional implementation is to be done. So very, very important. I don't need to go through this in details about classifying work activities because I've talked about it in the first page. You group work because location, department, like I said, stage, plant, and very important, I need to talk this. In every ship, you have risk assessment from different jobs. But if the job has not been discussed during the daily work plan meeting and you need to conduct, you need to carry out that task, what you need to do, you need to, develop an unscheduled or an unplanned risk assessment to cover that task. It's very, very important. Even during cargo operation now, you must have a risk assessment to cover loading and unloading. So I'm going to just rush this because you understand about classifying work activities, talk about hazards. We talk about sources of harm already because we are short of time. You know, how do you identify hazards? Here there are different categories of hazards. Some are mechanical, electrical, physical, radiation, substance, fire, and explosion. You know, especially when you are dealing with hard work, you know, working in engine room, working in hazardous areas is very, very important. Chemical, dealing with paints and chemicals. There are this biological degradation, you know, different. You have different, these are the, you record it in this hazard section. So you have identified the hazard. So for instance, now there's a typical example here. They say during work activities, could the following hazard exist? We talk about slip and fall on level. Which work activity I'm talking about? I'm talking about maybe you are preparing a combination ladder or you are working at loft, you are working at height. It's very, very important for you to know that this hazard exists. You know, tools can fall, materials can fall to injure person. So these are all the hazards that you identify. Inadequate headroom, inadequate ventilation. It depends on where you are working. So it's very, very important. These are all the hazards that you need to do. So next thing we talk about, I've discussed it already, is to identify the risk control. So like I said, you have to look at the most effective way to reduce this risk or to eliminate it or to reduce it as reasonable, as low as reasonable as practicable. It allowed. It's very, very important for you to do that. So some risks is not possible for you to reduce it. Then the job should not be carried out if you cannot reduce that risk or if you cannot eliminate it. You don't even go to that to carry out that risk because it's a question that will be asked. Okay, what if these risks cannot be eliminated? For instance, now you need to paint the ship side and there's heavy weather. You know, you have a gale force, you have heavy wind, heavy swell, the ship is rolling. You cannot reduce that risk there. What do you need to do is suspend the job. The job should not be carried out. It's very, 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 very important for you to talk that. So we talk about estimating risks. It talks about severity and the likelihood. We have discussed it already. You can look at it here. So I'm not going to go more into it. I've talked about this risk estimator. Very, very important. We are talking about coursework here because it's shipping, it's maritime, it's more generic. But if you go like for my research, I presented during a conference about the impact of port resilience safety. You know, is I now use a different type of risk matrix because what happened that I have to look at the whole event that have happened in Africa that has led to disruption in port. You know, is about port resilience. So this risk matrix is not generic to other aspects of the operation. This is just a recommendation by coursework. So it's very important so that tomorrow, if you move away from shipping and you are possibly working in aviation industry, you will find out that the matrix is different. So it's very, very important for you to know that. We talk about the risk tolerance already. We have discussed it. So I'm not going to dwell more on it. I really wish we have more time to talk about the action plan, reviewing your action plan. You know, how do you review action plan? By elimination, you know, by substituting something with less hazardous risks. You know, if it is not necessary for you to use, for instance, you are working at loft and you need to use boson chair or a stage, and there's a risk associated with that. The option you have, the substitute now, you can be able to rig a stage to work aloft. That will eliminate a lot of risks. So it's very, very important for you to know these are just the action plans, what you need to do. And we talk about reviewing your action plan, very, very important. So I wanted us to do a coursework, something like a class, interactive class section. So it's about an anchoring operation. As a chief officer, you have an anchoring operations, and then you are going to anchor in Tenerife tomorrow, and the master asks you to develop a risk assessment. So I wanted us to have a go, but because of our time, we are already way out of time. We can't be able to dwell on this. So maybe for future class, we can try to look at it before we continue. And I'm going to be cautious of our time in our subsequent classes. So I think I just have to stop here because we are really running short of time. So I think that's even my last slide, because an interactive section I wanted us to have. So I've said there are different publications that have a detailed information about risk assessment. One of it is Code of Safe Working Practice for Merchant Seamen. The other one is you go to MCA website, you have full information. The Merchant Vessel and Fishing Regulation 1999 also have detailed information. So thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate your time. So if you have any question to ask, the floor is open to you.
Thank you very, very much, sir. Thanks for it. This was really well explanatory. We can kick off with that, if you don't mind, next week with an explanatory on the on the assessment. So we just make it a work protocol.
Okay, all right, that'll be fine. Yeah.
Then maybe we can move into another topic.
Okay. All right, so I'll keep on to this for the next one.
Okay.
Yeah. And then we also look at the young persons working on board.
Right.
We look at charter party in addition to that, something that's brief.
That's good. Does anybody have any question for tonight's class?
Yes, I do.
Yes, I have a question, sir.
I can have a question, sir.
Okay, next, Umar.
Okay. So my question is about the stop work authority. I want to know how it works and who can declare a stop work.
Anybody can.
Okay. Thank you very much for asking this question. The stop work authority, the safety officer, statutory safety officer, have the duty to stop any work that he feels is unsafe. You know, that is a legal requirement. It's one of the duties of safety officer is to stop any work that he feels is unsafe. But
so is it only him that can declare a stop work?
No, not only him. I'm just talking about statutory. But if you look at the duties of personnel on board, if you go again and look at in chapter 13 of COC, it says you have the responsibility of safety on board your ship. So if you have the responsibility of safety upon your ship and you see anyone doing anything that is contravening the safety requirement, you have the duty to stop. That's why today, if you look at all the companies in the world, you see stop work authority is very important. Stop work authority, if you see something is wrong, please stop immediately. You don't even have to just step in and stop. So everybody have the responsibility to stop work, but statutorily, if you talk about the duties of safety officer, it's clearly stated here that his duty is to stop any work that is unsafe.
Okay, sir.
So all the right to also, issue a stop work, but let there be a tangible reason why you are getting the stop work, and then the final comes from the master or the safety officer. So you an officer or an AP or anybody, there is also the privilege of you stopping.
So, but what if you declare a stop work and the person does not stop? What then happens?
You report him to the master straight away.
Okay.
And then it's not even if the master did not do anything, one of your duties. We are going to talk about DPA. Every crew member have direct access to the DPA ashore. You report anything that is violating the safety requirement of the ship.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay, so please, I want to ask, can we?
JJ, we just hold on, please. Let Levi, then after, I don't know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Kenya, after Kenya, then JJ, please. Yeah, Lima Kilo, are you there? You raised your hand second. Okay, I think we've lost. JJ, please go ahead, please.
Okay, I want to ask, can we have more than one safety officer on board at the time?
No.
Okay, and it now brought me to, we have some of all these utility vessels that is working offshore, where you have plenty crew, different department, different company in the
In
vessel,
that case, yeah.
and they have their safety officers too.
Yes, in that
Okay,
case,
how do we talk about that?
I give you an example. If you are going to, let's say, even the code palm, you are going to a dry dock, for instance, now, and you are going to engage in a lot of things. You have a dedicated ship safety officer, and you have someone that is in doing a dry docking safety officer. Then I used to go as safety officer just for dry dock, and they have a dedicated ship safety officer. My own, I'm not responsible for entering everything in OmniSafe. You know why that's one of the duty. We talk about recording accident and incident. And in the case of the company I used to work for, Nigeria LNG, then you have to make those entry in the program called OmniSafe. Different companies have different programs of entering. So because of the tax involved and the volume of work, so the company decided to say, okay, we'll be able to have this number, X and X number of safety officers on the ship. So even if you go by coursework, it's still there. In ship like passenger ship, where you have a large number of crew members on board the ship, then you should be able to have some certain people that can assist the safety officer. But it's one person actually that's going to make all those recommendations, but you still have the setting, because it's just like in the car passenger ship now that you have two masters, but it's actually one navigation master and the other one is the calling staff captain. So it's one that makes the whole decision for the whole ship.
Thank you. Yeah, Lima Kilo, you can go ahead now to question.
Okay, my question goes this way. If I am on board a vessel, either as a captain or as a company representative, and my vessels are waiting maybe a further operational instruction from the platform, prior to that time, probably 1 hour, and finally I got a radio call from the platform telling my vessel to proceed for a particular task. Before then, how do I do risk assessment? Because you said risk assessment has to be done before the tax has been carried out. But this tax has not been pronounced. Maybe they kept it classified, or it's unpronounced or not yet identified. How do I handle something like that? I don't know if you get, because I've been in
Yeah, I
ships
get your
like
question.
that.
Yes. So you should be able, that is one thing, is the master of the vessel should be able to take certain decision. Number one, the primary responsibility of the master is to ensure safety of the ship, safety of the passengers, safety of the ship, and safety of the cargo. And as the master of the ship, you should be able to tell them, okay, your crew have not been able to carry out this type of tasks. You should be able to have adequate time to conduct risk assessment. For instance, I don't know much about offshore supply vessels,
Okay.
but definitely you'll have a charter party. And in the charter party, you should be able to, there are some terms that are stated, there are tasks that you'll be able to do. Maybe it has to be, maybe you'll be carrying pipes to platform or whatever it is, or water and everything. So if you are anchor at the platform, I presume you already know the tasks you are doing, but if they don't explain to you before carrying out any tasks, be it for examination purpose, a risk assessment must be conducted first, no matter how urgent it is. Even if you have an injured person that you need to evacuate him on board, you need to conduct a risk assessment to ensure that the evacuation will be able to take place smoothly without harming others. You know, the idea of risk assessment is to eliminate risk, but if you just go ahead and carry out this task, maybe it's a heavy lift, your crew have never done it, they don't know the dangers of standing under something. You see the first picture I showed you when I'm doing this, and that is what will result, that was what will happen. So for exam purpose, you need to tell the examiner that you as a master will not go. When I was doing my command assessment in NLNG, they asked me a question that as a master of a vessel, if I'm allowed to go to a port they only gave me the charter debt. That means it's not actually a real debt. What will I do? I told them I'm going to consult, different publications, check the chart. They say the chart is not available. I say, well, I'll stop at the pilot station, and ask the agent. They say I'm on rush for cargo. I say, no, the agent must bring the chart for me. I should be able to see that it's a depth that my vessel will be able to go in first. Because you have to look at it. Safety take precedence over, cost or whatever, chartering and all those stuff. The last lecture I mentioned about issues of Piper Alpha disaster, trial of free enterprise, Brunsfield explosion in US. When you look at all these things, there are incidents that are avoidable. They are avoidable. But what happened? Risk assessment was not carried out. There was failure of leadership. The management and the shipboard personnel. There is this gap that was breached, and that's what brought about ISM code. So it's very important for you to tell the examiner that you must conduct risk assessment before going in.
The final question, it's a layman question anyways, but I want to know, a JSA, which is job safety analysis, is it similar to risk assessment or they are different?
It's absolutely similar. I give you an example. I work for Chevron now. What we call JSA, what we call our risk assessment is JSA. And when I used to work for NLNG and Shell, it's called risk assessment. And when I was selling as extra master in Chevron Shipping, one of the VLCCs, they call it job hazard analysis. So they are all risk assessment. It depends on the name you give. Yes.
Do you advise, lastly, that before carrying out a task, I should give a command as a company representative that stand by, I want to carry out a risk assessment to this very task, probably 15, 10, 20 minutes, as the case may be?
Definitely. That is the recommendation. Even the company will applaud you for that.
Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
I'm just gonna add to that it's not just a recommendation, it's a statutory requirement for every operations that you carry out on board.
Exactly.
From my own also experience as master on supply vessels, before that happens, when there is an incident or even a near miss, is where is the risk assessment, and then the carrying out of other investigations. But even if the investigation the result of the investigation does not show that risk assessment was not what's positive, they're still going to fault you for not having a risk assessment. So a risk assessment for every single job that you carry out on board is really very important. And they are of whether this job is a minor job or a major job, because a minor job, there are also things that people will look that might lead to a major disaster. So it is very, very important for even the master or anyone. And if you notice any job that has even gone far, even to 20% or 50% or 80% as well, and you notice no risk assessment, or if the job also, maybe Captain Caleb also will teach us on permits to work as well, because there are that does not stop on risk assessment. You also need permits to work. So if you get to 80% and you discover that the risk assessment has not been completed, or if you that is completed, it has not been complied with, or two, there are circumstances, maybe environmental circumstances that might have changed when they were doing the risk assessment. You the job, and that is not just up to the safety officer, it's up to even everyone there as well, and the final commands come from everyone. So even though we've carried out a risk assessment, we should also know that changing circumstances are going to affect the safeguards that we've put there. So meaning the safeguards we put at the beginning are not going to be beneficial again, are not going to be useful at this point. That is when again we come and issue another stop work again. But also, so risk assessment and then permits to work. Like I said, maybe Captain which shows on permits to work.
We'll talk about permit to work. Yes,
so permits to work as well is also very important for some jobs. But every single job must have a risk assessment. Everyone, especially any fleet you are, be you on tanker, be you on container, be you on supply vessel, be rig, FSO, and so on.
So are you saying if I'm to carry out a particular task 100 times, I am to carry out a risk assessment 100 times?
Yeah, you
Yes.
carry out a risk. Yes, sir. Particular, please go.
Yeah, just go on here.
Yeah, you carry out a risk assessment 100 times, but now where the good part can be, where there can be flexibility, is if you have this risk assessment already laid down. And like I said, there are some standard risk assessment. Like me now, I'm a marine superintendent. I formed some risk assessment and sent to the company. So the company follow up this risk. I mean, to the vessels. So the vessels follow up this risk assessment. It's not like every single time they look. I mean, they start to form a new risk assessment for it. So they follow this risk assessment and ensure that these safeguard measures have been put in place, and also look for ways to review the risk assessment. So it's not like, okay, we are doing mooring today, we are doing mooring tomorrow. I mean, we are doing mooring in the morning, one in the afternoon, one in the evening. Then there are new papers. So like my previous company, I can mention them, the toppers and all this, they have standard procedure, but for every new task that you do, you bring out your risk assessment and you make sure it's being filled, is everybody in the party. I mean, everyone who is going to carry out one task or the other, they know their own special duties and the safeguard measures are there. So that is another thing about the coursework. You should not say because we are repeating the same job again, then we neglect the use or the need for the risk assessment.
Yes, that's a good one. In addition to what you say, even in fleet like LNG, even a job that involve maybe mopping, there's risk assessment, you see they involve it. Ordinary mopping of floors, there's a risk assessment involved. You select it for daily work plan. And the bosun is going to, the bosun carry out a meeting with the crew in the morning and he discuss, okay, you are going to do this, what they are going to do. If you go to the Shell fleet, yeah, when I was in Shell fleet, they even advanced, they now call it revised risk assessment, or what we call revised toolbox talk. Whereas the person doing the task is going to be the person that is going to identify all the risks rather than the supervisor. So normally, normally it's the supervisor that is going to discuss these are the risks. But in this case, it's a person that is going to do the job, that is going to, tell us, okay, this is the risk, this is the risk. So then we call it revised toolbox talk or risk assessment. So in some companies, they call risk assessment toolbox talk.
This is sounding a bit similar to after action review.
Which one?
The person who is handling the tax coming out to assess it. It's more like an after action review.
Yes, but this one you do it before the job. You do it before the job. Because now, if you are going to carry out, let's say you are changing a pipe in engine room, the supervisor will not be there with you. You understand? He will conduct the risk assessment for you, but we know the there. But Shell now realize that a lot of incidents happen because people doing the job don't actually know the risks. People pinpoint the risks, so they allow you to pinpoint the risks yourself. So I don't know whether that practice is still there or not, because that happened when I was possibly like, I think I was chief mate, was third mate there, second mate or so.
But from your assessment to this very practice, is it very effective? Just in case it wants to be adopted.
It's very, very effective, but what you need to do is still the two-way system is good. The supervisor should also talk, and then the person carry out the job should also identify, because let me tell you, there is a project I did, is about risk perception. So there's an oil tanker in a refinery in UK. I can't remember the place, but there's about an explosion. It talks about risk perception. So the oil tanker was spilling oil. People were walking and passing. They didn't understand. This one will walk and pass. The reason why they walk and pass, because they don't have the perception of risks. And what happened? There was an explosion that happened. So it's very, very important for you to have risk perception. That comes with experience. That comes with exposure. So what I see, I can be able to point out something and a cadet cannot be able to point out. So why I say two-way is better, because if you just allow the cadet to do, there are other things that he might overlook. He doesn't know this might happen, pipe might give way at any time. But when you explain to him, it broadens his knowledge. So I think the two-way risk assessment between the supervisor and the person carrying out the task is an effective way of eliminating risks. That is my opinion. It's not something that is legal or it's written anywhere.
Thank you very much, Captain Caleb. So clear. I appreciate you all.
Yes, you're welcome.
Thanks very much, Captain Caleb. Thanks to everyone. This today was really a very interesting class. I have a lot of modules to go my way. Captain Caleb, thanks again. We'll be
You're welcome.
expecting, we'll be expecting the way your class again next week. Maybe we'll start with the risk assessment project so everybody gets this as well. But also you can just send it to the group. Or you can give me, I'll put it on the group so everybody are well prepared ahead of next week.
Okay.
Saying we'll talk about the permits to work as well next week.
That's fine, yes.
Yeah, okay. And then with every other young persons as well. All right, thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir. And thanks to
you're welcome. I promised to, last time I promised to send something about the shift of timber deck cargo, right? So I have it here on Word format. So, but I can just send you the title now here. And then if you go to MIB website, you can be able to find detailed information about it. You know, shift of timber deck cargo on general cargo vessel Senegal, resulting in lease and loss of timber. You know, it's in Dover Strait, so it's MIB report. So you can look at it. You know, I promised it last week, but I couldn't because I had a couple of things here. My apologies for that.
It's fine. Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, you're welcome.
We've seen it now. Yeah, you still have one more question. Is someone raising up his hand? Okay. With that, I think we'll end the class for today. And everyone come again with your questions tomorrow. Next week. And we'll have another lovely time again with Captain Caleb. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Captain Caleb.
Thank you very much.
Next week. Bye.
All right, see you. Bye.
All right, bye, guys.
Bye.